how does energy flow through food webs? That's what we'll be talking about in this video. Organisms use their energy to perform the characteristics of life. Some organisms are able to use sunlight to power their energy needs. These organisms are producers, or autotrophs. And this prefix auto means self, and troph means feeder. So producers, they are self-feeders. They're able to generate their own energy from sunlight. Heterotrophs, on the other hand, are organisms that are not able to photosynthesize, but must get their energy from somewhere. So hetero means other or different. And troph, again, means feeder. So autotrophs are the self-feeders. Heterotrophs need to feed on another source. They need to get their food from somewhere else. And so they often feed on other organisms. This series of food source and predators, which are organisms that feed on other organisms, is known as a food web and can sometimes be quite complicated. Here are just a few examples of food webs. The first one, in a freshwater environment, we have our producers, which are the algae. They can be fed on by mollusks like snails and clams. Then there might be, the snails and clams are called primary consumers because they're feeding directly on the producer. Then there might be a variety of small fish, like the slimy sculpin, is a secondary consumer because it eats the snails and clams that eats the algae. And then we have our apex or tertiary predator. In this particular environment, it's the Chinook salmon. They feed on the slimy sculpins, which feed on the mollusks, which feed on the algae. And we can see there are 4 different steps in that particular food chain or food web. In the larger picture, we see a more complex example of food webs. There are multiple producers, both marine plants like phytoplankton and other types of algae, and terrestrial plants, things like grasses and other plants. And there will be the primary consumers, which feed directly on the primary producers. Those will be things like different types of zooplankton, small invertebrates. You might also have snails and grasshoppers, different types of insects. Now, also included in this level would be larger plant-eating organisms as well, things like cows and elk and moose. But as the food web continues, there will usually be larger organisms that feed on smaller ones, and then even larger organisms that feed on those. These are food webs, and yet all of these, whether they're directly or indirectly photosynthesizing, they're getting their energy from the sunlight and from the products of photosynthesis. Now, only about 10% of the energy in any level of a food web becomes biomass in that next level. Biomass represents energy stored as biological tissue or energy-rich molecules. So there's only about 10% of the food that is consumed that becomes biomass in that next level of the food web. Plants are not able to convert more than 10% of the energy from the sunlight that they absorb into biomass either. So let's talk about some of these different levels in the food web, starting with a primary consumer. Primary consumers are organisms which feed directly on plants and other photosynthetic organisms. primary consumers are not able to convert more than 10% of the energy they receive from the plants they eat into biomass. Secondary and tertiary consumers are the higher levels of the food web. Each higher level of consumer feeds on organisms from the previous level, and depending on the complexity of the food web, there may or may not always be tertiary predators. Each step up the food chain has the same less than 10% conversion efficiency. At the top of the food web are the apex predators. These are predators who have no known enemies. They do not get preyed upon typically by other organisms, especially in their adult form. So the predators at the top of the food web are known as the apex predators. These are organisms that, as adults, are rarely, if ever, prey items. And they often balance the ecosystems. All organisms eventually die. The resources left behind in their body needs to be returned to the ecosystem, or the ecosystem would not be sustainable. This role is covered by decomposers. Decomposers break down organic molecules in dead bodies and waste products and convert those into nutrients. This is an essential role in an ecosystem. The nutrients released by decomposers are usually used by the primary producers to continue growth. As we saw with photosynthesis and cellular respiration, ecosystems have a cycling of matter, but a flow of energy, with the energy starting at the sun, moving through the food web, and ultimately being lost as heat. The sun is the primary source of energy for almost all ecosystems. This includes any ecosystems, which include humans. Humans are usually the apex predators of any ecosystem that they are a part of. So what types of energy can we get from living organisms? Well, we'll talk about that in our next video.